Hello and welcome to episode 100 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Amalith.
I'm Kevin.
And I'm Andy.
Good to talk to you all again. And we made it to 100 episodes of this show, and it's not really just about 17 episodes on it. Anyway.
That's 86 based.
Yeah. So today, Andy's got a question for us, and that is, how many languages should you learn?
There's a lot of different ways you might ask this question, right? And what I want to avoid is intimidating people and saying, you're not a real programmer until you've learned this many programming languages or something like that. But if we can avoid that kind of stupid argument and just talk about what's a good way to get into programming? What's a good way to develop as a programmer? Does it matter if all of your experience is in one language? Stuff like that.
Depends how much you're getting paid to write Java or whatever, if that's all you've learned. If you're on, several 100K with a good retirement plan.
I mean, I guess it does partly depend what you're in it for, right? Like for me, I'm in it for the love of programming and wanting to be really good at programming, as good as I can be.
I imagine if there are people out there that got into programming purely for the monetary aspect or the job, that seems like that'd be a really hard industry to stay in for very long, especially to do multiple languages in. But I don't know, I'm sure those people exist.
I know those people exist. I've heard them on podcasts, people who specifically got into being a developer because it's a great job that pays well. And that's the beginning and end of it for them.
That's actually the majority of programmers I know in person and the ones I went to school with. It's an easy, stable job and it pays well.
Well, I guess to clarify, not to say that that's not the reason you got in, but I would imagine in order to do this full time for years, potentially decades on end, you would have to have some level of enjoyment or at a bare baseline tolerance of the thing that you're doing. That's more, I guess, what I was getting at was if you got into programming purely for the monetary aspect and you hate it, it's not the way your brain works, it's not something you enjoy, staying in it just for those reasons seems difficult because it's a very brain-heavy profession.
Yeah, I think if you hate it, yeah, but if you just tolerate it, it's much better job to tolerate than something where you might injure your back and not be able to work anymore, or you have to be outside, or stuff like that. If you like the indoors and you like getting paid well, it's not a bad profession, right?
Very true. I stand corrected.
Yeah, if you don't like your eyes very much and you're happy to stare at a light bulb 8 hours a day.
Just get some nice glasses that block the blue light.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to the question.
Yeah.
If you want to be a good programmer, let's say, how many languages should you learn, or is that a silly question?
I think maybe it's how many different types of languages, like where they sit in the stack, what their paradigm is. I think that's actually more important than the just raw number of languages, because you could learn all variations of JavaScript and it roughly all be in the same stack and kind of same paradigm. So I think maybe it's the variation of things that and because each different type of language, whether it be like imperative or functional languages, they get you to think about the problem set in a different way. That's what's really handy, as well as sometimes when you learn a different language, it causes you to readdress a problem from another perspective in ways that you may not have thought of before. And I'm thinking of when a lot of people talk about learning Rust, and then they say afterwards, wow, that kind of made me a better C programmer, because now some of these things are foremost in my mind about how the memory can be borrowed or lent out and needs to be owned. So it just causes you to think about the problem in different ways, even when you're not using that language anymore or even actively.
That's definitely my experience, right? Every time I learn a new sort of paradigm, I came back to a language I'd been using before and I felt kind of more powerful. I had a new way of thinking about how things work. But I wonder whether there are people listening who would say, don't waste your time with different languages. What you want to do is really become really powerful in one language where you know all the corners and you can be really productive.
But that one language and that one ecosystem might not be the best fit for all of the situations you might find yourself in.
True.
I think it's good to have the languages you might need in your tool belt so you can reach for them when you need them.
I think my general advice to somebody who was starting out, I would actually give them the advice of just one. That's all you need. Only one. Pick one. Go for it. Because that would get them into the field, into the profession. I mean, most of the languages all share commonalities, right? Loops, functions, all those different things. So by taking all of those decisions and, possible stressors off of their plate, just no, learn this one thing, learn it really well. That lets them get into, get all the basics, get all the foundation laid. And then after that, you can say like, oh, actually, what I meant was this other one too. Have you thought about learning Haskell or something along those lines? Which I don't know Haskell, so that's definitely not a requirement. But I think you introduce that to them later. And then by that time too, hopefully they have a better understanding for what another language may or may not provide. And it may provide just other job opportunities. Mm-hmm. It may provide different levels of the stack, or it may provide just something fun, as in a new way to look at a problem or a new challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I would really hate for us to have a conversation that was like, you're not a proper programmer until you've learned this many different programming paradigms or any of that kind of rubbish, right? Like, if you write programs, you're a programmer. But like, in terms of if you're interested in getting better at that, I totally agree with you, Kevin, that if you're starting out, just get the hang of something, right? Get your head around it. I don't care what that is. I learned a bit of Sinclair Basic, and I really learned on Amos Basic, which is an awful programming language. But, you know, I got the hang of it, and it helped me understand what programming is. So it served its purpose.
Maybe we could also divide this between how many programming languages should you know versus how many do you actively use, like that are kind of upfront in your brain and you could pull them out on a whim and implement something in them. Because I think those two numbers may be different for people. At least they are for me.
How are they different for you then?
I would say the number of languages that I know, or at least am familiar with, as in I've used them for a time and now I may not actively use them. For example, a long time ago, I did Java. I probably started programming seriously or paid with C#.NET. That was many years ago. The current Java or current C#.NET, I would probably not be able to write if you told me you have 5 minutes to learn something, go. Now, I am familiar with the language and I could pick it up very quickly because I've used it before, but it's not something that stays up front with me. It's not something that I use on a day-to-day basis. In fact, I haven't even used it in probably over a decade. So I would qualify myself as knowing the language. I know the syntax. I'm decently familiar with the standard library, but I wouldn't say that that's a language that I actively use and wouldn't qualify that as like, hey, this is something that I could use tomorrow if I really, really needed to, and then just drop again.
But presumably the principles that you learned from that, you've applied to other languages that you now work in.
Oh, absolutely. For example, Java is extremely object-oriented. So for a while, that was how I approached all programming, was in this everything is an object and everything comes from an object and is some other type of object, and it all is just this giant hierarchy. And it wasn't until later on, I actually don't even remember which language, that eventually broke for me. And I realized there are other ways to think about a program and other ways to structure your program. Some ways are more appropriate in certain circumstances than others. So it peppered the way in which I learned languages to an extent until trying out new things.
Interesting, just thinking about changing language. My first paid job, full-time job, was writing C++, but it was in a team who had recently been writing Java. So they wrote all their C++ like Java, and it was in various ways that's terrible. And so I had to kind of unlearn a lot of that C++ that I picked up from there and learn what C++ really is like to be really good. And that goes back to the thing of like depth in one language is also a really valuable thing. You don't want to be just spread across loads of different stuff, because the deeper you get, the more you get how a language is thinking about the world, and then you can use it more effectively.
I've heard a lot of people say that it's good to strive to be T-shaped in lots of different areas. So you have your really deep knowledge in one area, but then you have broad knowledge in a lot of other areas.
And what would you classify depth for in a particular language? So, for example, what I'm thinking of is people like to say C is a very simple language. And while I would agree, syntactically, C is a pretty simple language, I would say semantically, C is an extremely difficult language. And if you start to also incorporate things like the standard libraries or dependencies or the ecosystem, eventually I would say C is arguably an incredibly complex language. And the inverse could be said of other languages. So how do you clarify depth within a language? Is it just knowing it syntactically, semantically, the ecosystem?
I don't know. I probably don't know any language deep enough to have that knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just experience, right? And like, so the more time you spend, and especially the number of different problems that you've faced and gone through, and the different phases of projects and things that you've gone through with a language, like with anything, you know, then you end up with more depth of knowledge.
And I wonder if that maybe ties back to what I was thinking about with languages that you know versus ones that you actively use and feel comfortable with daily. So, for example, like C# or even to an extent Java, I would say I'm comfortable with the syntax and even mostly the standard library, but I don't consider myself comfortable with the language per se because I consider that a lot more like the ecosystem, the libraries, much more what are the current idioms of said language. So I think it goes a little bit deeper in my mind with those languages.
Of course, each time you go back to C#, they've added a new type of class-like thing with new semantics around whether you can create a new one and whether it's a value or...
Exactly. The idioms evolve, the patterns evolve, the best practices evolve, warts come out and warts are avoided. Uh-huh. The language is constantly changing. All languages are constantly changing, I would argue. So keeping up with that is something I would consider to say, like, if you have deep or deep-ish knowledge about a language, that those things will be required.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by 1Password. In a perfect world, end users would only work on managed devices with IT-approved apps. But every day, employees use personal devices and unapproved apps that aren't protected by MDM, IAM, or any other security tool. There's a giant gap between the security tools we have and the way we actually work. 1Password calls it the Access Trust Gap, and they've also created the first ever solution to fill it. 1Password Extended Access Management secures every sign-in for every app on every device. It includes the password manager you know and love, and the device trust solution you've probably heard of on this podcast back when it was called Collide. 1Password Extended Access Management cares about user experience and privacy, which means it can go places other tools can't, like personal and contractor devices. It ensures that every device is known and healthy, and every login is protected. So stop trying to ban BYOD or shadow IT, and start protecting them with 1Password Extended Access Management. Support the show and check it out at onepassword.com/LinuxDevTime. Quick bit of admin then. First of all, thank you everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to linuxdevtime.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And you also get quite a lot of episodes a day or so early. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can email show@linuxdevtime.com.
So if we're recommending that you should learn different types of language if you want to broaden or deepen your ability as a programmer, what are good examples of like different types? If I'd learnt Python, would moving to Java change to a completely different type, or would it be almost the same? Or?
With Python, doesn't it depend on how you use Python? Because it can be both object-oriented or procedural, right?
Sure, yeah, that's going to be true of other languages as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's the languages that are strictly one paradigm and others that are much more loose. So I guess it depends on the language. And to be clear, too, I don't think that to be a good programmer, and no one has said this, so I think we all agree here, to be a good programmer, you don't need to know more than one paradigm. You can be a perfectly good or even expert programmer in a single paradigm and single language.
Yeah.
I do think that it helps and you can grow by expanding. And even just dipping your toes in some of the other paradigms will open up your eyes to other possibilities, which like an immutable language where everything is mutable. That's a whole new way to think about different patterns, but it also opens up other patterns which can be shared across languages.
And it is fun.
Absolutely.
Like, it's so much fun to like be really stuck because you just don't get this thing.
I was stuck, I think yesterday, actually, on Haskell. I decided I wanted to write this program that recursively and in parallel spiders a file system to calculate the size of your current directory. And I wanted to do that in Haskell. That was hard.
Do you know Haskell previously, or was this a off the cuff?
It was very much off the cuff, talking to sort of trying to pair program with an AI and have that AI try to teach me enough basics to make this thing happen.
There was your mistake.
Yeah.
It did work, actually. And I think the program is okay, but I don't know for sure.
Just ask the AI. It'll tell you it's okay.
Uh-huh.
Actually, I have a top tip for Haskell specifically. If you want to learn Haskell, start by learning Elm, because Elm uses Haskell syntax, but it removes most of the most difficult concepts in Haskell. What I found with Haskell is when I read someone else's code, they were always using the like PhD level constructs of the language, and I was utterly lost. And when I learned a bit of Elm, which is a front-end language that compiles to JavaScript but has Haskell-like syntax, it was nice and simple, really fun. Now, there are there are some questions about like the project direction of Elm, but as a way of learning Haskell syntax, like I can completely recommend it. Very interactive as well.
There's this idea of the joy of code, right? And they talked about that on Linux Matters, must have been a month or so ago. And that has to be a big part of it, right?
Yeah.
If you get stuck in this rut of just writing Rust or just writing Go or whatever it is, something you've talked about, Andy, of writing Snake in this new language just for the joy of it. I mean, that surely has to be a good way to keep yourself sane if you're working in this industry.
Absolutely. Like when my work is painful, I notice that I spend more time on hobby projects, and whatever's difficult in my work, I end up doing something that's kind of the opposite. So if work is very boring, then I'll do something very interesting. But if work is very frustrating, you can't make progress, then I'll do something very easy as a like hobby project. But yeah, I'm very aware that like I'm really motivated by that joy, but I don't feel like you should feel like you have to have that, right? It is something that happened to me. You don't have to have it to be a good programmer.
Absolutely. And I think even the thing that you're working on, you don't necessarily have to have joy about the thing that you're working on.
No one ever has joy about the thing they're working on, right?
Well, hobby things you can have joy about that. But yes, at work, I would say I very rarely think, wow, this is an amazing new button that I'm programming here.
I think the consistent feeling that I get from programmers who work as programmers is that the thing they're working on is terrible and they're really sorry about that, but they still love programming.
Yeah, and that's what open source is for, right? Like you work on this horrible proprietary thing during the day, and then evenings and weekends you work on the open source stuff. If you're not lucky, like you are at least, Andy, to work on something that's very publicly open source.
It's like in Wayne's World. They gave me the job to do Wayne's World. That's a very out-of-date reference to a film that has not aged well.
It has not aged well at all, and Amalith has no idea what we're talking about.
Nope, not a clue.
You know the guy from Austin Powers? Like, he did movies before that.
Uh-huh.
Austin Powers might be too far back.
I've seen Austin Powers at some point, for sure.
Okay, good.
What's a good way to stay on top of languages you want to keep in your tool belt?
That's a difficult question, right? Because why do you want to keep it in your tool belt? Is it because you like it?
You might like the language, but not necessarily have any use cases for it at the moment.
Do something fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot of different like code katas, and there are little exercises set up. Like, I think, what is it? Exorcism.io or Rustlings or Ziglings. Like there's always little repos like that where there's just small self-contained problems that are fun. Advent of Code, actually, every year.
Oh, yeah.
That's a lot of fun. Do that in a new language every year, and that's a blast, usually, especially if you're doing it with a group of people.
I've started Advent of Code every year for the past 3 years and never finished it.
No one finishes. Everyone does the first two.
The awesome thing about Advent of Code is you can always do it all year long, and you can go back to it.
Is that a little bit like NaNoWriMo, where no one ever keeps up with that? You know, you start your novel in November and you do about 3 days of it, and it's like, no, I'm just done with this.
Yeah, definitely. So it's funny that you mentioned katas and Advent of Code and stuff like that, Kevin, because some people really love that stuff, and I really enjoy it, but it's not the thing that keeps me coming back. The thing that keeps me coming back is like an actual project that I want to finish. Often it's a game or something like that. Because almost every project that you do that's real has some times where it's a bit of a struggle to get yourself to work on it. Sometimes that's because you're working on something hard, and so actually pushing through that is how you learn and improve.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balance, too, because I've seen a lot of people that will either get into the industry or are new to programming and say, I want to do, they have some massive idea. I want to build a better Facebook or something like that. And just not understanding how monumental of a task that could be. Now, sometimes that's good because that lets them charge forward and start working towards a problem. They solve interesting problems. They learn a lot doing it. But other times it's a little bit of a detriment when they realize like, oh, I can't make the next AAA video game in a weekend. And that's a little bit disheartening, and then they can fall off. So I like things like katas and the exercises that you can do as just an idea. Start doing something until you have a better idea or until you have something that really excites you and that you would like to see built.
That's cool. I would definitely say pick something small. My son was working recently on, he always has massively overambitious projects, but he was working recently on a thing that encodes messages like in very old-fashioned ciphers, like Caesar cipher or whatever. And so it's like a command line program. You don't have to do any GUI, but it's helping him get his head around, the basic for loops and all that stuff. And it's finishable, right? And I think that is like that frustration of like, I failed, I didn't get there. shouldn't have that feeling on your fun projects, right?
Absolutely. And sometimes it's not even finishable. I would argue that it just needs to be able to show stepwise progress, because sometimes that is enough to get some joy out of just showing the incremental improvements that you've made, even if you can't actually finish it.
Yeah.
Just the improvements are enough to keep you going or show some progress.
Yeah, and the way I hack my brain on that is I always try and choose fun projects that are really testable. So then every time my test passes, I feel like I've achieved something and I've kind of ratcheted forward. So it gives me that little buzz every time.
So I don't know that we've actually answered the question at the beginning. How many languages should one learn or know?
As many as you want. Do what you like.
I think that's a great answer.
Have fun. But also you should be aware of other languages that you might be interested in, like Haskell, as we mentioned, or Rust, which has this concept of ownership, which is not shared in other languages, or object-oriented languages.
Yeah, and presumably, if you become an expert in one language and then that language falls out of favor, there's kind of a period where it's tricky to get a job, but then eventually you end up being really in demand.
Yeah. Yes.
So it can't hurt to be an expert in one language, but it's probably wise to know some other languages and concepts at the same time from a pure kind of employability point of view.
There's that T-shape again, yeah.
And I've always tried to look for jobs where people were looking for someone who's good at programming, not someone who's a real specialist in one thing. That's because of my personal taste, right? That I want to be someone with a kind of broad spread.
I think that might also be what the anxiety-inducing decision about picking a language, why so many people spin on that one particular choice of which language do I start with, is because it's a significant time investment. There's a lot of time involved in learning and becoming an expert in that thing. You don't want that thing to be suddenly useless, as if the previous hundreds of thousands of hours of your life were somehow a waste. And I think the thing that we're getting at here is all of those hundreds of thousands of hours, if you were an expert in one single language, that's not a waste. You are now so many legs up on the next language or the next paradigm that it's absolutely not a waste. And like Joe said, there may come a time where fast forward and you are one of only a few people who happens to be an expert in said language and can now charge a pretty penny.
Absolutely. And I think the things you learn are not just things like how does a for loop work or whatever. There's also loads of really completely transferable things like what is Unicode? How do I handle that? Why is time so difficult? All of that type of stuff. And I'm sure there's loads of other, fonts or whatever, whatever area of code you're talking about.
Oh, even just the soft skills, communications. How do I convince other developers about my idea, and how do I communicate that idea and articulate it to them in a way that, I can fight for my own positions, as well as all of those written and verbal communications. That's super key in development as well.
How do I survive code reviews without feeling like I've been crushed, but still able to robustly defend my position or whatever? Yeah, all of that stuff. Absolutely.
Right. Well, we better get out of here then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. But until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
I've been Kevin.
And I've been Andy.
See you later.